Hey guys, this is our PowerPoint on the executive branch, the White House, presidency, all that good stuff. Um, and so yeah, it's gonna take a little bit of time here to go through everything, but just stick with it, and hopefully you guys can watch this over the series of several days, space it out, and let's go. All right, so the first thing is just kind of interesting. Just to see some of the perks of the presidency. He makes $400,000 a year. The Congress sets that salary plus 50,000 for expenses, and another 100,000 for travel. He gets really good health care. He has his own personal doctor to attend to him. Of course, he gets to live in the White House, which is really sweet. You can see a picture of it there in the bottom left, one of the rooms. Just really fancy, really nice, obviously. There's like a movie theater, bowling alley, golf simulators, all sorts of cool stuff in the White House. Plus you have your own personal chef and things like that. Anyway, you can see he has Secret Service protection, and actually that continues after he's president. Camp David is open to the president to take family and foreign leaders and members of Congress, whatever. You can see that on the top right. Of course, he gets to travel on really cool Air Force One and Marine One helicopter and stuff like that. He gets to travel around in limousines. Plus, the president gets cut off there, but he gets 210,000 currently $210,700 pension every year after their president. So the current ex-presidents, you could see some in the picture in the first picture, like Obama and Clinton and Carter, and they get Bush, they get that salary every year for the rest of their life. So pretty nice. Most presidents have not been particularly diverse. We've had 100% male, 99% white. The only, Obama was the first non 100% white president. You have the vast majority have been Protestant Christian, college educated, a lot of lawyers, and very few were, started at the bottom. You know, it's they're often born into privilege or into the, a decent status of the society. All right, so what does the Constitution say about the presidency? First off, the executive branch is described in Article 2 of the Constitution. Remember, Article 1 sets up the legislative branch. So Article 2 describes the powers of the president. It begins with the words, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. So this was a debate at the Constitutional Convention. There were those who thought maybe the president should be, the presidency should be maybe a council of people, but they ultimately decided not to do that and just to put the power of in the hands of one person. If you remember earlier this semester, we talked about Montesquieu. We looked at his writings, and he said it's important to put the power of the executive into the hands of one person rather than the legislature, which should be many people. You should have many people helping to make the law, but you should only have one person really in charge of enforcing the law, because that makes everything more efficient. The job of the executive branch essentially is to get stuff done, right? To carry out the laws, run the government, etc. So that's better to put in the hands of one person to be ultimately in charge. And the only two people mentioned in the Constitution as far as executive branch officials are the president and the vice president. But of course, today we have, something around, almost about 3 million civilian employees in the executive branch, and then another, 1.5 million or something military personnel. So the executive branch is really big, but the only two positions created in the Constitution were president and vice president, and everything else, all the cabinet secretaries and all the other executive departments and everything, all were created by Congress. Congress has the power to create executive agencies and departments. The only office that can't be, abolished would be the presidency and the vice presidency. All right, so then what qualifications do you have to meet to run for president? Now, you guys should be, if you're my students, filling out the notes as we go, but you should also be taking additional notes on stuff you feel is important, because remember, you'll be able to use your notes on the test for this particular time when we're out for the coronavirus. So just, use your own discretion to write down other stuff you see that may, you think is important. So this is on your notes, but so what qualifications? There's 3 qualifications. So first, you have to be a natural born citizen of the United States. You must be at least 35 years old, and then you have to be a resident of the United States for 14 years at least prior to running for office. So the one people get tripped up or kind of maybe don't understand as well as the natural born citizen. That does not mean you have to be born on U.S. soil. Now, if you are born in the territory, in the country of the United States, you are a natural born citizen automatically, but you can also be born overseas and still be a natural born citizen. So, for instance, if your parents are American, or at least one of your parents is a citizen of the United States, when you're born overseas, you're still a natural born citizen. You're a citizen at the time of your birth. So just keep that in mind. But you can see the age, also just real quick, the age, think about, remember, House members have to be 25 at least, senators have to be at least 30, and president has to be at least 35. And this also applies to the vice president, all these rules. So I've heard some people on the news talking about, who should Biden choose as his running mate? And, they're mentioning, sometimes they mention people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which, he's not going to do, but he can't do that anyway, because I think she's 30 or 31 years old. So she can't be vice president. So people are kind of, even in the media, people don't really understand, what they should know more about what they're talking about. So, but anyway. But yeah, you can see that they wanted someone with even more experience to be president. Okay, so the Constitution originally just said the president can be elected for a term of 4 years. So each time the president would be chosen or elected, they would serve 4 years, and then they could go for re-election. Originally, there was no limit on how many times you could run, although people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and James Monroe and Andrew Jackson, all these guys who were elected twice, they all stepped down after their second term. But then you had, back in the 1930s and 40s, you had a president who ran more than twice. He ran for a third term successfully, and then he ran for even a fourth term successfully. So you guys, I don't know if you know who that is, back in the 40s and 50s. But that was Franklin Roosevelt. So you can see up at the top right. So FDR ran and successfully was elected 4 times. Now he died early on in his 4th term. So he served more than 12 years, but just not much more than 12 years. And then anyway, Truman took over. But so anyway, after he was president, a lot of people thought, hey, the president really shouldn't be in power that long. And so they thought that might have set a dangerous precedent. So the 22nd Amendment was passed and added to the Constitution in 1951. And that says that the president is limited to 2 terms in office, although there is a provision. So normally it would be 8 years. So if you're elected president, like Donald Trump or Barack Obama, they could only serve 8 years. But there is an exception where you could serve 10 years, up to 10 years. And that would be if the president leaves office or dies halfway through his term, the vice president takes over with 2 years left in that term. That vice president would become president, of course, and then they could also run 2 more times. But that would be a very unusual circumstance. All right, so who actually elects the president? We vote in November. But, we talked about the presidential elections, but remember, the actual election occurs when the electors vote. So who actually elects the president are electors from each state. And we call this body of electors, we just refer to it as the Electoral College. So the Electoral College, or really just individual electors, choose the president. We vote on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. They vote on the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December. So it's kind of a strange thing, but that's when the official vote takes place. So how do we determine how many electoral votes a state receives? Now, your typical answer for people would be, oh, it's based on population. That's wrong, okay? It is not based on population, it's influenced by population. It's a very important distinction, okay? So if you're asked on a quiz or test coming up, you know, how do we determine electoral votes? I'm just telling you, do not say population. It is not population. The correct answer is it's based on how many members your state has in Congress. So that means how many members do you have in House and Senate combined from your state? Now, is that influenced by population? Yes, because the House members from each state are influenced by your population, right? The bigger populated states have more representatives. But senators are not determined based on population. So this skews the numbers. It makes it so that every state is guaranteed at least 3 electoral votes, okay? So Georgia has 16 electoral votes currently. Also, remember, we do a census every 10 years. We talked about where they do reapportionment. So when House seats are added or subtracted to your state after the census, that will also affect how many electoral votes you receive, okay? So Washington, D.C., based on the 23rd Amendment, also gets 3 electoral votes regardless. You know, they get as many as the least populated state has. So even though D.C. is not a state, they do get to vote for president because they are citizens of the United States, people who reside there, you know, for the most part. So and yeah, so again, do not say that population determines electoral votes. And so again, it's based on how many members you have in Congress. Now, this shows the electoral map. This was as of the 2008 election, okay? So look at some of the states. Look at Georgia, 15 electoral votes. Look at Texas, 34 electoral votes. Look at, say, New York, who has 31, or Ohio, who had 20. Now, this was in 2008. So when Obama was first elected, this was the electoral map. You can see the minimum number any state has is 3. Okay, but let's look how it changes in the next election after the 2010 census. So look at some of the states that I pointed to. You know, Ohio lost 2 electoral votes. If you look at those little tiny numbers in the corner, you can see some of the states stayed the same. You see like Colorado stayed at 9 and Tennessee stayed at 11. They didn't change, but there were some states, you know, you see Georgia, we gained 1 House seat, so we also gained 1 electoral vote. Florida gained 2 electoral votes. Texas was the biggest victor by winning. They got 4 additional electoral votes because their population grew. So again, population influences electoral votes, but it's not the determining factor. Okay. You know, you see a lot of northern states lost electoral votes because their populations aren't growing as fast. So New York went from 31 to 29. Ohio went from 20 to 18. Now you can see California has the most electoral votes with 55. Now, if you were just, you know, an average person looking at this map and I asked you who benefits the most from this electoral system, a lot of people would say, oh, well, California, look, they get 55 electoral votes. Now, that's really a lot of votes, and that must give them a huge advantage in this system. Again, that is wrong. California gets really the short end of, I want to say a worse word, but they get really the short end of the deal here. They get really, you know, they have a huge disadvantage, as does Texas, as does Florida, as does Georgia. All the states that are more highly populated, they get shafted by this system. If you don't believe me, look at the population numbers. And if you think it's based on population, look at the population of California, which is about 40 million people, okay? And then look at the population of the smallest state, Wyoming, which I think is about 600,000 or less people, right? There's more people in Cobb County than there are in than there is in Wyoming. So so think about that. So Wyoming gets 1 vote for president approximately for every like 185,000 people or something like that. 1 vote for every less than 200,000 people. California, if you do the numbers, they get 1 electoral vote for like every 700 something thousand people. So I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but if we were in class, we would do the numbers on the board. But again, you can add it up. Figure out 40 million divided by 55, and figure out, how many electoral votes they get per person. And they get the short end of the deal on this. Okay, if you don't believe me, do the math. Again, the small states benefit from the Electoral College. They get more voting power per voter than they deserve by far. Okay, so it's not even close. And to me, this is one of the weirdest things about this system. And I really think this is a silly system that we have. And I would prefer we get rid of it and change the Constitution. But that's the problem. It's going to be hard to get rid of because it has to be changed in the Constitution. But anyway, I think it makes no sense to me that because you live in a state with fewer people, you get more power in choosing the president. If it's a national office, shouldn't we all have the same vote? If it was a national popular vote, we would all have one vote for president and it would all count the same, regardless of where you live. So we'll talk more about that. But I mean, also think about, the campaign. Where do you focus your attention? Now, again, you might think, well, candidates must spend a lot of time in California and Texas and places like that. Well, Texas is becoming sort of what we call a battleground state or a swing state, but where people spend their time, they do not campaign in California. You'd be like, that's crazy. Why? Well, because the Democratic candidate of late, at least in recent history, has easily won California. California is what we call a blue state. You can see the numbers. The red states are ones that tend to vote Republican. Blue states is what we refer to as the ones that tend to vote Democratic. Then some states are purple states, and that means they could go either way. I know some of you may also be looking at Nebraska and saying, why is that purple? Well, really that number should be pink, but if you look at the small numbers, we'll talk about that next. But Nebraska and Maine do a different way of doing it. But so another thing you need to know, which we'll get to, is most states use a winner-take-all system, but we'll get back to that. So what you do is you campaign. So you campaign in states where it's a battleground state, a purple state. That would be places like, of course, the ultimate battleground state is Florida. Probably the two biggest ones in recent times have been Florida and Ohio. In fact, no Republican president has ever won the presidency without winning the state of Ohio. Now, if we were in class again, I'd get into this more, but so states like Ohio, although Ohio is trending more red lately, Florida is definitely a very decisive state for the election, and it has a lot of electoral votes. So the states you want to campaign in are the ones that have a lot of electoral votes and are competitive or swing states. So either side can win. You can see Obama won Florida, but then Trump won Florida. So anyway, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, I think is going to be a really close state in the next election. Is going to be an important swing state. So it doesn't mean you don't have to have a tremendous number of votes to be an important swing state. Even like New Hampshire has been close in recent elections. But yeah, I mean, states like New York, California, Texas have traditionally in recent years been pretty well decided one way or the other. And so the candidates see no reason to campaign there because they already know who's going to win, if that makes sense, right? So just keep that in mind. All right, so how do you win the election? Well, you have to accumulate electoral votes, and it takes 270 electoral votes to win. So think about there's 538 votes. You have to win a majority to win the presidency. So 538 divided by 2 is 269 votes. You need a majority, so it goes to 270. So when Bush won in 2008, in the year 2000, when George Bush became president, he won with 271 electoral votes. It was one of the, I think it was the closest electoral vote in history for a winner. And so Bush beat Al Gore, who had been Clinton's vice president, by only one vote more than he needed. And so now he actually lost the popular vote. Also in 2016, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote but lost the electoral vote. So that's another bizarre thing about this system. You can win more votes in the country and lose the election, okay? So we'll come back to that when we ask the question, does the popular vote even matter? So again, popular vote, that means the vote of the people. The electoral vote is the vote of the electors. So, and again, you may be asking other questions. how the electors are chosen within each state. We'll come back to that. Yeah, so in Georgia, there's actually only 16 people who get to vote for president. In 2020, there'll only be 16 Georgians who actually get to cast a ballot. They'll get one vote for the president and one vote for vice president, which was established in the 12th Amendment. All right, so anyway, so what most states do is what's called winner take all. The only states that don't do that are Nebraska and Maine. So Georgia and 48 other states, or 47 other states, use winner take all. What that means is if you win the popular vote of that state, you get all of that state's electoral votes. So if Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton in Georgia and he got, which he did, if he got, I think he ended up winning like 51% and she had like 46%, and the third party candidates got the rest. But let's just even say it was like he won 50.1% of the popular vote and she won 49.9. If he got 1,000,001 popular votes and she got 1,000,000, right? He would still win all 16 of Georgia's electoral votes. So even if the state is fairly divided, winner takes all. So again, whoever wins the popular vote of the state wins all of that state's electoral votes. And it doesn't even have to be a majority. I think we talked about the term plurality. It can be a plurality. So when we've had popular third-party candidates, remember we talked about Ross Perot? There were states like in Georgia in 1992. I think Bill Clinton got like, I'm trying to remember the exact numbers, but it was something like he got like 41 or 42% of the vote in Georgia. George H.W. Bush got like 40% or something. And then Ross Perot got like 16% or something like that. So it was, Bill Clinton didn't even get a majority of the state's votes, but he won more. He won a plurality. He won more than anyone else, so he got all of the electoral votes. So if you had like 4 or 5 candidates, you could have someone get like 35% of the state's votes and win 100% of their electoral votes. So again, the system is very bizarre in my mind. It makes no sense, and it leads to, basically very skewed results, like in 2016, when Hillary Clinton got almost 3 million more total votes than Donald Trump. So there were almost 3 million more Americans that wanted Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump, but he won the Electoral College. In fact, he won it fairly soundly with over 300 electoral votes. So I told you that 2 states do it differently. So here's one example of Nebraska. What they do is, which is makes a little more sense, is a little more fair. They divide their districts, and any state could do this, by the way, if they wanted to. They would just have to pass a law in the state legislature. But Nebraska divides it up by congressional district. So this was 2008. In 2008, John McCain won 57% of the votes in Nebraska. But President Obama, who ended up winning the election at the time, candidate Obama, he won one of their House districts. If you look at District 1 in the reddish color, District 2 is that greenish color, and District 3 is that sort of brownish, goldish color, whatever. And so now remember, the districts are set up by population. So that means District 2 is smaller, but it has virtually the same population as Districts 1 and 3. District 2 is where Omaha is, so that's where the biggest populations are in Nebraska. And so Obama won District 2 by a slight margin, so he got 1 electoral vote for winning that district. John McCain won Districts 1 and 3, so that's 2 for McCain, 1 for Obama. And then McCain, remember there's 2 electoral votes that represent your 2 senators, and so they award those to whoever wins the statewide vote. So since McCain won more statewide votes, he gets those 2 bonus votes. So the final tally in Nebraska was 4 electors for John McCain and 1 elector for Barack Obama. So just keep in mind again that these electors are real people. Now, another thing that just to mention quickly, how does this actually work? So again, if we go back to Georgia in 2016, Hillary Clinton had 16 Georgians who were pre-selected. So when people vote in November, they're really voting to elect the electors for that person. So you're not voting for Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump or whoever else. You're voting for their electors. whoever gets the most votes, their electors get elected. That means they get to actually vote in December, that first Monday after the second Wednesday of December. So when Donald Trump won the popular vote in Georgia in 2016, all 16 of his pre-selected electors were chosen. So another thing that goes against kind of the way the founders intended this was they wanted, why do we have this in the first place? Why do we have the Electoral College? Well, the original thought was that they would have, that they would be these sort of wise, elite members of society who would be chosen as electors, and that I think the most founders hoped that they would just choose the best person, right? And that they didn't trust the people to make this really important decision. So you might say, well, isn't that still true today? Don't the electors make the choice of the best person possible? Aren't they wiser and better educated and more informed than the average voter? Well, the truth is the electors are just party loyalists. So because of political parties, remember they weren't factoring that in the Constitution. There's no mention of parties. They were hoping, I guess, sort of idealistically, that the electors would vote based on who's best regardless of party. Well, that quickly changed with the formation of parties. So in other words, so the electors for Donald Trump in Georgia weren't going to say, well, let me now look and see, I've been chosen for this important task. Let me now pick the best person possible. They absolutely were going to vote for Donald Trump, and all 16 of the ones from Georgia did. Now, there were a few electors who changed their votes in 2016, but that was very, very, very unusual. And none of them changed to the other candidate from the other party. They just changed to other random people. But so that again, 2016 was a very unusual election. But almost never do electors change their votes. So they're not really these wise people making the choice. They're just pre-selected party loyalists who are going to vote how they said they would vote. So again, so in Georgia, Trump's 16 electors were elected. Hillary Clinton's 16 electors were not. And there was a Gary Johnson, who was the Libertarian candidate. His 16 electors from Georgia were not elected. So only Trump's got to actually cast a vote. All right, so then what if nobody gets 270 electoral votes? This actually has happened twice. So if nobody gets 270, then the election gets thrown into the House of Representatives. And this has happened twice, 1800 and 1824. The Senate would also then choose the vice president if nobody had a majority for vice president. So the House would pick from the 3 top finishers, and each state would get 1 vote as a delegation. So California's 53 House members would have to decide together how they cast their 1 vote, right? In Georgia, again, we would be relegated to 1 vote. What it would come down to is essentially, in Georgia, we'd have, the Republican majority in our House delegation. They would vote probably for the Republican, right? They would decide to cast Georgia's 1 vote for Republican. It could be a problem, though, because when they made this rule, there were 13 states, right? Now we have 50. So you could have a 25-25 tie, and then what would you do? There's no real answer to that. Also, what about states who have even numbers of House members? Let's say, what if Georgia had 8 Republicans and 8 Democrats? Maybe they wouldn't be able to settle on who they should vote for. So what would they do? Play rock, paper, scissors to decide or something? That would be like the highest stakes game of rock, paper, scissors ever. It's just kind of, it's a silly system. In my mind, why not just let people vote and everyone gets 1 vote? And if you win the most votes, you win the presidency. It just seems to make sense to me. That's how we do every other election, right? That's how every other country who has a free voting system chooses their leaders. Basically, it's like, why do we have to keep this really antiquated system? And anyway, it's kind of frustrating. You can tell I don't really like the Electoral College at all. So the big question, does popular vote even matter? And the answer is sort of yes and no, okay? Now, does the national popular vote matter? No. The national popular vote does not determine the winner, right? We've talked about that. But it does matter within each state, okay? So it's basically what we have is 51 separate elections. If you include Washington, D.C., there's 51 elections for president, and you just have to string together the right combination of states in order to win, right? So you could win a minority of the states, but if you won like California, Texas, Georgia, New York, Florida, Michigan, Ohio, whatever, it wouldn't take you very long to get to that 270 mark, right? But of course, not all those states vote the same way. But if they did, you could win with a fairly small number of states. So it's not national vote that matters, it's the state by state vote that matters, right? Again, most states use winner take all. So if you win the popular vote of that state, it does matter because then your electors get elected. Okay. Um, so now we have had 5 presidents who've been elected, even though they lost the national popular vote. So I think on my handout, I have you list those maybe, but I can't remember. But if that's the case, so who were the 5 presidents who won, even though they lost the popular vote, but they won the electoral vote, or in one case ended up winning the House vote when no one had a majority. So anyway, going back in time, I think so. You have Donald Trump, of course. Then you had, like I mentioned, George Bush. George Bush won the electoral vote but lost the popular vote. So you had Donald Trump, George W. Bush. The other 3 were who won even though they lost the popular vote were Benjamin Harrison, Rutherford Hayes, so Harrison, Hayes, and then John Quincy Adams. It's kind of interesting how 3 of those 5 were people who also had like a father or grandfather also as president, right? So you had Bush, George W. Bush, his father was also president, Benjamin Harrison, whose grandfather was elected president, and John Quincy Adams, whose father was also president. So it's kind of interesting. So what would be some alternatives to the system? Well, the obvious alternative would be just to get rid of the Electoral College and go with a direct popular national vote. Now, although I think that would be the best way to go, it would be very hard to do that because, again, you'd have to change the Constitution. Remember, to change the Constitution, it takes a 2/3 vote of the House, 2/3 vote of the Senate, and approval from 3/4 of the states typically. So you could do a national convention, all that stuff. That's probably our best chance. But anyway, it would still be very difficult to do because a lot of states like this system. Who likes this system again? Well, states like Wyoming and Montana and Alaska and North Dakota and South Dakota, they get a big advantage, even though it doesn't seem that way if you look at the map. Also, states that maybe are swing states, they kind of like this because they get lots of attention. They get millions of dollars of TV ads played in their state, and that helps their economy and things like that. So, maybe states like Ohio and Florida, even though they don't benefit electorally, they still benefit from being swing states. So maybe it would be hard to find enough states who would vote to get rid of this because it benefits them to keep it. But for Georgia, for example, we do not benefit from this system. Now, you could do what Maine and Nebraska do. So why don't more states do that? Wouldn't that be more fair to divide it up by district? Well, the problem is, think about Georgia. Georgia has a Republican legislature, right? If they put in a district by district model, who would that help and who would that hurt, right? So in 2016, Donald Trump got all of Georgia's electoral votes, even though he only won 51% of the vote in Georgia. Well, if they changed it to district by district, he wouldn't have gotten all 16 votes, right? Hillary Clinton would have won probably, I think, 4 out of the 16. So that, so why would states change it? If California changed it, that would hurt the Democratic candidate. So a lot of states, it's in their political interest to keep it this way. You could also do some type of proportional vote where each state, you kind of divide up the electoral votes by percentage. You could even get rid of the actual electors, although you'd have to change the Constitution and just do a division of each state. But again, why not? Like, to me, number one just makes the most sense. I know some people say, well, that would hurt the small states, and my answer is, too bad for them, because just because you live in a state where nobody else wants to live doesn't mean you should get more votes for president, right? Just because you live in Alaska where it's really freaking cold doesn't mean that you should have more say in who becomes president than someone who lives in the sunny state of Florida or California, right? If you don't like it, then, move to another state. But everyone's vote would count the same. To me, that seems just inherently fair, right? Anyway, it's crazy. So which system do you think is best? Well, you kind of know where I stand on this, but I'd be interested to hear your commentary if we had class together. All right, so shifting gears, we're now looking at presidential powers and duties. So what powers does the president have in the Constitution? All right, so these would be what we call his formal powers, things that are listed mostly, again, in Article 2 of the Constitution. So these aren't in any particular order, but these are some of his key powers. Now, I don't think for my students there's space for this on your handout, so you probably want to write these down on a separate sheet of paper, okay? But I think it also is maybe part of your outline, though, so you might want to go ahead and fill in some of your outline. All right. So first off, what is the president's main job? So remember, the legislative branch makes the laws. So what's the president's or executive branch's job? Their job is to enforce and carry out the laws, right? So they take the laws that are put down on paper and they actually put them into effect. So this can be enforcing law, like actually, the federal government, the executive branch is the one who prosecutes federal crimes. So you have the Department of Justice and the Attorney General. Their job is to prosecute criminals who break federal law. So it's that type of enforcement, but it's also just like to make sure the laws are not just being followed, but that the laws work, right? To make the government work. And so if Congress creates a new healthcare system, the executive branch executes that. They're the ones who set up the healthcare system. They're the ones who deal with doctors and providers and insurance companies and pay them, and like for Medicare and so forth, Social Security and things, that these programs that are carried out by different parts of the executive branch. So they basically make the country run, and they're the ones who provide, who run the agencies and departments of the government. Okay. So we'll come back to that when we do, bureaucracy, talk about the bureaucracy. All right, so what are some actual powers in the Constitution? First, again, not in any particular order, just one of them is that he's the head of the armed forces. So the president is referred to as the commander-in-chief. Remember, only Congress can declare war, but if war is declared, the president would lead the military strategy along with hopefully his generals and other advisors. Right? But the president is the head of our military. He's our top military officer. Okay, the president also has appointment power. This is a huge power. He can appoint, I think, several thousand officials total. It's in the thousands. I can't remember the exact number. But this includes all federal judges, which is a huge power. He gets to pick Supreme Court judges and other federal judges, which means he can pick people who support his policies and who share his ideology. He picks ambassadors, appoints ambassadors, and other executive officials like cabinet secretaries and heads of departments. And remember, though, that the Senate has to also approve these appointees. The president can negotiate treaties with foreign countries. So again, all this stuff is in the Constitution, his formal constitutional powers, or his, you could say expressed or enumerated powers. Now, the president often does executive agreements instead, which we'll talk about later, because treaties are hard because, again, they need to be approved by the Senate. In this case, it takes a 2/3 vote of the Senate, which is very hard to do. Okay, the president also has the power to pardon criminals or potential criminals. That's kind of an interesting power. It's an absolute power. The president can pardon anyone. The only limit is that it has to be someone who committed a federal crime. So there's no check on this power. The president could pardon, if he wanted to, someone who was accused of a terrorist attack or something. And President Trump has used this power. And sometimes, presidents will do pardons that are pretty controversial. Usually they'll do those at the very end of their term as they're out the door, and they might pardon some friends and political supporters and things who committed crimes. And they're just like, who cares? Hey, I'm out of here, suckers, see ya. But yeah, it's a pretty big power that the president has. So you want to, if you're a good friend of the president, because some presidents have pardoned their family members, things like that. So, it's pretty much an absolute power, other than you can't pardon someone for a state crime. The president, of course, can veto bills. This is a huge power because the president can stand in the way of legislation that Congress passes. Because remember, to override, Congress can override a veto, but it takes a 2/3 vote, and that's very hard to do. Now, sometimes the president will, of course, he can negotiate as Congress is thinking of a bill or passing a bill. He might say, hey, if you don't take this part out or if you don't include this, I'm going to veto it. So he can also play a role in the negotiation process as the bill is being passed. Now remember, he has other options. He can he can let the law become law or if the bill's not signed in 10 days, it automatically becomes law. So the president might do that, just as like for a symbolic act of like, hey, I don't really like this law, but I'm gonna let it pass or whatever. But anyway, he can also do the pocket veto, but that's rare. That would just be if Congress passes the bill with less than 10 days left in their session and he doesn't sign it or veto it within those 10 days, it's automatically vetoed. President can convene Congress, so that means he can call them into session. So if Congress was on a vacation or something, he could call them back to Washington if he needed to for some emergency session. Like for instance, if he's asking for relief for the coronavirus relief fund and their Congress is out of session, he could call them back to meet and discuss those plans. Or if if a country invaded us while they were out on summer break or something, he could call them back to Washington. All right, he can propose laws, including the federal budget. So he's supposed to suggest laws in the Constitution. It says the president, is supposed to sort of give his best input as to what he wants to accomplish. Of course, Congress has to pass every law, but he can at least ask for things. And a lot of ideas for laws do originate with the executive branch. He's also supposed to greet leaders, so he has the power to like greet foreign leaders or meet with foreign leaders, ambassadors, discuss issues. The president has a big advantage. A lot of people debate like who has more power, the executive or legislative branch. Well, one area where the president clearly has more power is foreign policy, because largely because he's one person. Congress has foreign policy power, right? They can declare war. They have to approve officials like ambassadors. The Senate has to approve treaties, but the president has a clear advantage when it comes to foreign policy. I would say Congress has an advantage when it comes to making domestic policies, like changing tax laws or immigration laws, things like that. The president can also recognize foreign countries, so he can give diplomatic recognition to countries. This came into play, for instance, when President Obama granted diplomatic recognition to the new country of South Sudan back a few years ago. So that's kind of an important power, although not frequently used. The president also is supposed to address Congress. This is more of a responsibility or duty than a power. But he's supposed to give what's called the State of the Union address each year, where he gives a Congress an update on how things are going in the country. But he also uses it often to lay out his agenda for the next year and like things he wants to propose and things he wants to accomplish, which often involves Congress passing legislation. Just a few examples of presidents using their power. So Grover Cleveland was a big vetoer. One other thing that I didn't mention is, of course, presidential power is influenced by who controls Congress. So if we have what's called unified government, if the same party controls the presidency and Congress, of course, it's easier for the president to achieve his goals, his policy goals. But if you have a divided government where one part of Congress or both chambers of Congress are controlled by the other party, the opposite party of the president, that makes it much harder to get things done, and that can lead to much more gridlock or stalemate. And so Grover Cleveland was a Democratic president, but he presided over a Republican Congress. So his check was, the Republican Congress was passing bills that he didn't agree with, and he vetoed 414 bills. And you can see how hard it is to override a veto because only 2 of his 414 bills were overridden. Now, Cleveland also is interesting because he's the only president who served 2 terms non-consecutively, right? So he served 4 years, then he was defeated, and then he served another 4 years after that. FDR has the record with 635 vetoes, but remember he was president for over 12 years. Bill Clinton, so treaties are very hard to get done. Bill Clinton signed a treaty which was actually unanimously approved by the Senate, which is very rare that the Senate agrees on something. But this treaty was actually, the U.S. agreed to an international treaty where we signed on to say we would not use children in war. So even that was something we could all agree on. Hey, we're not going to send, 12-year-olds over to fight in Iraq or Afghanistan or something. And then the pardon power, you can't really see, but the Gerald Ford made a lot of people angry actually when he pardoned Richard Nixon in 1974 after Nixon had resigned, or 74 or 75. It was, so yeah, 74. Anyway, he pardoned Nixon, and it was like, I think the pardon said basically he was pardoned for every crime he committed or may have committed from like 1972 to 1974. So it was like a 2-year blanket pardon for anything he had done that ever was uncovered, which he broke a lot of laws during that period, and he could not be prosecuted for that. He was free. He was free of punishment, and that's what a pardon does. So just real quick, just to remind you, checks and balances, of course, a big part of our government. So what are some of the key checks that exist over the president? And what are some checks he has over the other branches? So quickly, you can read this, but basically the biggest check the president has over Congress is he can veto laws, right? Now, of course, they have a lot of checks over him. They can override a veto, although that's very rare. The Senate has to approve presidential appointees. The Senate has to approve treaties, right? So you can see some of the checks. They're not all listed there, but and of course they can impeach and remove the president. That's yet to happen in our history, but although we've talked about presidents who were impeached, right? Trump, Clinton, and Andrew Johnson, but none of those 3 were removed by the Senate or convicted. As far as the judicial branch, the main power the president has is to appoint judges to positions, which is a big power. But of course, remember, they serve, well, we haven't talked about that, but they serve for life. And so, in a sense, that's kind of a check they have, because the president can appoint people, but he also there's a lot of people in the judiciary that were appointed by previous presidents. So he can't just stack the courts with all of his appointees. He has to also keep in mind that there's lots of judges from previous presidencies. But the main check the judicial branch has over the executive branch, and the main check the judicial branch has over the legislative branch, is what we call judicial review. They can declare presidential actions to be unconstitutional. They can strike down his actions. So if the president takes an action, so let's say, when President Trump did his travel ban originally, he said he banned travel from certain countries. I think the federal courts, so it's not just the Supreme Court, but any federal court. At first, they struck down his travel ban as being unconstitutional because they felt like it too much focused on people from Muslim countries, and he was banning people based on religion, which was unconstitutional. But later, they amended the travel ban, and it was upheld. But the courts can strike down presidential actions or executive orders and things like that. The president has a lot of informal powers. So far, we've been focusing on his constitutional powers. Excuse me, but equally as important are a lot of his informal powers. And so, these are in sort of a weird order here, but I'll put them all up here, and then we can go through the list real quick. All right, so one thing is he's sort of the national spokesperson. He is because he is the leader of the country. He is the person people look to for leadership. And so he speaks for the country. He's supposed to be there for the country in times of trouble, and things like that. So in the sense that he sort of is the embodiment of our country in some ways. The president can also do executive orders. There's a funny SNL skit I'll post the link to, but an executive order gives the president tremendous power. Now, it's not unlimited, but he can make an order that has the force of law. What's the catch? Well, it has to be something that's within his powers to do. So something that stems from either something he's been granted the power to do by Congress, or the interpretation of a law, or ordering someone within the executive branch to take a certain action. The easy example I can think of is when President Truman was president, by executive order, he desegregated the military. So prior to that, military units had served in segregated units by race. He ordered that to come to an end. So what power does he have that gave him the authority to issue that executive order? Well, he's the commander-in-chief, right? So as head of the armed forces, he was able to issue that executive order to desegregate the military. Executive agreements also give the president a lot of power because executive orders, executive agreements do not need to be approved by Congress. Again, though, there are limits to these things, but an executive agreement is like a treaty, but it doesn't need congressional approval. So the president can make an agreement with a foreign leader that is like a treaty, but doesn't need Senate approval. So you might say, well, why doesn't the president just always do that and not ever bother with treaties? Well, the answer is he pretty much does. He doesn't, rarely do we have successful treaties. So the executive agreements may or may not be submitted to Congress for approval. They don't have to be. The catch is, so the president can make these agreements, but the next president doesn't have to follow them. Whereas with a treaty, the next president is supposed to uphold treaties. So treaties are better if you can get them, but executive agreements are much easier to do. So, but like for instance, President Obama entered us into the so-called Iran nuclear deal by executive agreement. He basically agreed on behalf of the United States to abide by this Iran nuclear deal, that we would let them have nuclear power but not develop nuclear weapons, and they would agree to inspectors and things like that. But in exchange, we released some of the sanctions we had on that country. Well, President Trump and a lot of Republicans didn't like that agreement, so he canceled that agreement and he withdrew the United States from that. Also, we had entered the Paris Climate Accords under President Obama, which is more of an aspirational thing, but that we had agreed to try to meet certain climate goals, and President Trump pulled us out of that agreement. If it had been a treaty, it would have been much harder for President Trump to withdraw from those things. All right, so the next one is also really important. He has tremendous access to the media. Again, you can see that recently with President Trump's coronavirus updates, whatever. He has these press conferences, and they go on. The other day, it went on for over 2 hours. He has the bully pulpit. What that means, not bully like pick on someone, but bully meant like back when this was coined by Teddy Roosevelt. It means like awesome, like an excellent or really great thing, right? So the bully pulpit, like a pulpit where a preacher preaches from or something. So the president, can reach out to the American people, and the media is going to cover it. Okay, so unlike a member of Congress who may not get much media attention. Even, say like Joe Biden right now, he's running for president, but he doesn't have that bully pulpit that President Trump has. So that can be used by the president to push for what he thinks should happen. The president can push, for instance, for a law he wants to be passed, or, try to sell the American people on what he wants to accomplish. So the president has this unique ability to reach out to the American people, often through the media, but of course now we have social media, which gives the president even more power to reach out directly through things like Twitter. The president also sets the agenda for the country. So again, even though Congress makes the laws, a lot of people look to the president for guidance on what we should be doing. He helps guide that agenda. You can see those points there. He's also crisis manager. Again, we see this with our current crisis. The president is looked to for leadership, right? Now you can decide whether you think President Trump has been doing a good job leading us through the coronavirus, but the president is looked to. So when you have a major disaster like a hurricane, or of course, if we have any crisis right now, a health crisis, but if we were in a war or something, the president is looked to for leadership. He also has access to lots of experts who have lots of expertise. So, of course, he has to use those experts and listen to those experts. But the president, unlike other politicians, has all these expert people within the executive branch who can give him advice, and also people he appoints to help him. He's also his party leader. So being the party leader is not something in the Constitution, but the president is clearly the leader of his political party. He's also a global leader. So the fact is, presidents of today, of the modern era, are more powerful by nature than the presidents of the 17 and 1800s. Why? Because they're seen much more as a global leader than they were in the past. Because the United States is the preeminent superpower in the world, that automatically makes the leader of that country more powerful. People look to the president for global leadership, right? And so, again, that's a big responsibility. Now, the president's power can be affected by many outside factors. So one thing is the president, we talked about one is just simply who controls Congress, right? So if the party that controls Congress is the same as the president, that boosts his power. But another thing that can give the president a lot of power is what are his approval ratings? Do the American people largely support him? Through most of President Trump's presidency, his approval ratings, I think through pretty much maybe except, I don't know, maybe at his whole presidency, rarely though has he gone above 50% approval. That means that, maybe makes it harder for him to push his agenda. If a president is really high approval rating, it's much harder for Congress, even if from the other party, to say no to what he wants to do, because the people, he can, again, reach out to the people for support, right? So his approval rating often can affect whether he's effective as president. Another big thing, though, is like what point in your term are you? So towards the end of the president's term, he becomes what we call a lame duck. Okay, so just like, a lame duck just means basically your power is diminished. If now this would automatically happen in your second term. So towards the end of a president's second term, Congress is not likely to listen to him very much or want to do what he wants to accomplish because everybody knows he can't be reelected. So that kind of diminishes your prestige or your power. Also, if you're in your first term and you lose reelection, so let's say President Trump loses in November, he would still be president until January. So that would be the lame duck period. Obviously, it would be hard for him to get much accomplished during that time. Here you can see Barack Obama's ratings during his presidency. This is a Gallup poll. This would be called a tracking poll. It asks the same questions. Do you support or do you view the president's job favorably? Is he doing a good job? And how do you rate him? Anyway, so they would ask that same question over time. And you can see his approval rating started very high. And he was able to accomplish a lot in his first 2 years because he also had a democratically controlled House and Senate. So that's where he was able to get a lot of stuff done. So he was both, we call that the honeymoon period, like when you're first elected. Even if the Congress is from the other party, they may, work with you on getting some things done. So you can see his approval rating was almost 70%, but then it dips significantly, right? Which tends to happen with any president. Although he, peaked again enough at least to win the re-election. But then you can see in his second term, he kind of struggled in the 40s percentage, favorable rating. But then towards the end of his presidency, which sometimes happens, but not always, is you saw in the last year of his presidency, his approval ratings really went up and, back into the high 50s when he left office. All right, so now we're shifting gears into roles of the president. So what roles is he expected to play? These are based on his formal and informal powers combined. But we're looking at kind of what different hats does the president wear? What are some of his parts of his job description essentially? And so these aren't a definitive list. You would see different lists in different terms, like in different websites or different textbooks. But I'm just going to go with the ones that I've used in the past. But pretty well sums up some of his main powers and responsibilities. Okay, so these are more like what does the president do and what is he expected to do? The first one, again, these are in no particular order. One of them is head of state. And this is more of a ceremonial role. So this would be similar to like what the Queen of England, the role she performs in England, Queen Elizabeth. So he's looked to lead the country, but this is more in a ceremonial fashion, right? So sort of that idea of the chief citizen. Um, so, but yet these things are important, although maybe not critical, because it helps bring the country together and it just provides us with some sense of unity and things like that. So the president, for example, can be sort of somber things, like you can see President Bush laying a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier on Memorial Day. So the president is honoring people who've died for our country in war or in the service of our country. That's important. It's not, it's not like if he didn't do that, it wouldn't, devastate the country, but it's an important ceremonial function. It could also be, something more fun, like throwing out the first pitch of a baseball game to start out the season, which I'm missing right now. No baseballs, driving me nuts. But and plus the Braves were supposed to be pretty good this year. But anyway, so like President Obama did it a couple times, President Bush did it a couple times, where they throw out the first pitch. Now President Obama was made fun of because his pitches were not as sharp, as good, I guess. George Bush grew up, as a baseball player, playing baseball as a kid and stuff. So his pitches were actually better. But President Trump hasn't done that yet. But anyway, it could be also like hosting a dinner at the White House, okay? Like when the Queen of England came to the United States, having her at the White House for a nice fancy dinner, that would be more of a head of state function, right? Because there's nothing official. It's not like we're discussing global policy or something. It's just a get together at the White House. That would be more of a head of state thing to do, okay? Also, like the president, for fun, on Thanksgiving, presidents traditionally will use their pardon power to pardon a turkey. So like some turkey or a couple turkeys might get saved from becoming someone's Thanksgiving dinner. And so he pardons them and they get to live out the rest of their life on some farm, happy, fat and happy. So the next role, so again, if we were in class, I'd be showing you some clips of videos and stuff that back up some of these roles, but we can't do that right now. But chief executive kind of encompasses maybe the main function of the president, which is he's the head of the executive branch. Now, it's like he's the CEO or the big boss man of the executive branch. So this, of course, the president can't literally carry out all the laws. That would be impossible for one person to do. So really much of this role is sort of delegated to like his cabinet secretaries, who then delegate it to their various departments and people who work in the federal government, the people we call the bureaucrats, which we'll cover later, the bureaucracy. They're the ones who actually carry out most of the laws. But the president, again, is like the boss. He oversees the execution of laws. He kind of sets the direction. He can issue executive orders, like we said. He can to direct agencies to take certain actions. He picks, but his main job is to like appoint people, pick people. He picks people to head up these different departments and agencies, who then guide it in the way that he would like them to, or that's the idea, right? So he's more of a facilitator, or like he's more of he's the, like I said, the boss man, like the CEO, the chief executive officer of the government, to make sure things get done. But he pretty much has to delegate that authority. But it can be hiring people, appointing people. He also has to fire people sometimes. That could be part of his role as chief executive, replacing officials who he doesn't think are doing an effective job or who aren't following his desires or his mandates, okay? The president's also the chief legislator. Again, this is just a term. I mean, obviously the main legislative power is held by the Congress, but the president plays a big role. So he's just referred to as, chief legislator. He can propose bills, like we mentioned, or the budget. He's supposed to submit a budget to Congress, like what he wants to spend money on, what he thinks he needs for various programs, but ultimately they decide. But remember, he has to sign bills into law for them to become official, and he can veto bills. And like we've talked about, vetoes are very hard to override. It takes a 2/3 vote of the House, 2/3 vote of the Senate, which is really hard to do. But so this does give him a lot of influence over legislation. The president's also referred to as the chief economic planner. So this is more, kind of something that's developed over time. You know, I don't think originally the president probably didn't play as big a role in this area, but as our economy has grown and become more complex and it's become a global economy, the president is supposed to guide our strategy. So again, he can ask Congress for things. Of course, Congress plays a big role in that, but he also is looked to for leadership when there's economic downturns, right? So again, right now is a huge example of that. The president and Congress have to work together to come up with a way to help people who aren't working because of the virus, and people are staying at home, and a lot of people out of work. And so the president is expected to take the lead on that and respond to that, ramping up our unemployment benefits and things like that. But so especially in times of crisis or economic crisis, the president is looked to for leadership to bring down inflation or increase employment or whatever. But it's also during good times, the president is looked to keep that role and keep the economy rolling through his policies. So the president, along with his advisors, comes up with, and he has a lot of economic advisors. We'll talk about a few later, but that he's supposed to help promote the U.S. economy and grow the economy and keep it strong. The president, we talked about one of his informal powers. He's also expected to be the leader of his party, so he's the party leader. That means simply like whatever the president says basically becomes the position of his political party. You can see here President Obama meeting with or shaking hands with a guy named Tim Kaine, who was also he's a senator now, but he ran with Hillary Clinton as her running mate in 2016. But at the time, he was the chairman of the Democratic National Committee. So the president is often sometimes called the fundraiser in chief. That means he can raise a lot of money, not just for his own campaign, but for his party and for other people running in his party. So part of his job as party leader is also to promote and help other candidates win from his party, which also benefits him, right? If more people from his party are in power, that's going to make it easier for him to get his policies enacted. So the president might make a lot of campaign stops for people, especially, if he's popular. So if the president has a high approval rating, he can be a very valuable resource for people running for office. Just giving him, Trump, even though Trump may not be super popular nationally, but he is very popular still in certain states. So when Trump endorses someone like through Twitter, that can make a difference in a place like Alabama or any place in the country where there's more conservatives, more Republicans, right? So the president can raise money for the party, campaign for people from his party, and he also sets the agenda for like what we call the party platform, right? What they stand for. Okay, the president's also the chief diplomat. So I said he has tremendous power when it comes to foreign policy. If you're a foreign leader and you come to the United States, you could meet with members of Congress, but who would you rather meet with? Like a bunch of people from Congress or like the one person who's in charge of the executive branch? So again, the president, through negotiating treaties and executive agreements and the fact that he appoints ambassadors, all those things fall into this role as chief diplomat. So what's the difference between, say, chief diplomat and head of state? Well, let's say again, if you see here President Bush meeting with President Putin, President Putin, who's been in power for like 20 years on and off, either as he shifts back and forth between being president of Russia and prime minister of Russia. And anyway, it's just kind of crazy. But yeah, he's been in power now for over 20 years, I guess. But yeah, so if President Bush, if Vladimir Putin comes to the United States and Bush meets with him and they're discussing like serious issues, like working out an arms deal or something, like reducing our nuclear arsenal or something, that would be chief diplomat. That would be kind of a chief diplomat thing to do, right? Negotiating executive agreement or a treaty or something. But if he was then later, like Putin came to the White House for a fancy dinner and there was music and, everybody's dressed up, that would be more as head of state. So it just kind of depends on what's going on, whether something falls in one category or the other. So you will be, quizzed and tested on this stuff. So you need to know these different roles and how they apply. And then again, we've mentioned this before, but the president is the commander in chief. The title commander in chief is just something we use, but he's the head of the armed forces. But his role as commander in chief goes well beyond just like leading us in times of war. and like, heading up the military, because a lot of people mistakenly think the president can declare war, because so often in our history, presidents have ordered military action, right? And we talked about this in the last unit. That's why Congress felt like they needed to pass the War Powers Act, which said if the president sends troops into combat, he only has 60 days in which to get congressional approval. If he doesn't, he has to withdraw the troops. But the president often, even Congress, recognizes that the president has to take military actions, even without a declaration of war. So presidents have ordered bombing attacks or other military actions without approval of Congress. And so the president, being the head of the most powerful military in the world, gives you a lot of power. And it's hard for Congress to rein in the president's power because he is commander in chief, right? So anyway, so that's another big power of the president. Okay, so now we're shifting to, besides, we've talked about the president up to this point. Who are some of the other executive branch leaders in our government? Well, one of them is the only other person mentioned in the Constitution, right? The vice president. But so the executive branch is not just the president. In fact, again, there's lots of people who do really important things besides the president. So who are some of these people? Well, like I said, one of them is the vice. Now, the vice president is this a powerful position? Well, the answer is it kind of depends, right? The vice president does not have very much power in the Constitution. Really, you could say there's maybe 3 or 4 powers. Here's a few of them. But these are official responsibilities that I think are important, or that I listed as being in the Constitution. So you'll see, again, different lists sometimes. But so he's president of the Senate. Now remember, that means he can preside over the Senate, but we talked about this in the last unit. That doesn't actually give him very much real power. And most vice presidents don't spend much time doing that anyway. Now, he can, according to the 25th Amendment, he can help decide presidential cases of presidential disability. So if the president is unable to perform his duties, the vice president can step in and take over. This kind of poses an interesting scenario where, like, what if the president says he's fine and the vice president says he's not? Well, according to the 25th Amendment, the vice president, in order to take over and declare the president incapacitated or unable to perform his duties, he would have to also get a majority of the cabinet to sign on. There's 15 top cabinet officials who would have to agree with him, a majority of them. But yeah, so this is the only time, this hasn't really happened other than brief times. Like the president can also turn over his duties to the vice president temporarily. But like this could happen, say, if a president was in a bad accident or had a heart attack or something, and he was unable to perform his duties. So he was alive, but not able to perform his duties. The vice president would assume the powers until, if and when the president is able to come back. But George Bush, like, put Dick Cheney in charge briefly when he was undergoing a surgical routine procedure called a colonoscopy. But he was put out. He was, put under anesthesia. So he said, I'm shifting my responsibilities and informed Congress that, like, Dick Cheney was the acting president for those several hours. Once Bush was done and came out of the surgery and was back coherent, he said, I'm now resuming my powers as president. Okay, but anyway, the third thing, the biggest power the vice president has, is basically just to be the backup quarterback, right? He's there now. He's there if something happens to the president. So the times the vice presidents in our history have become most important is when they've had to actually take over as president, right? So when the president dies, resigns, etc., the vice president has to take over. And I believe this has happened 8 times in our history. So, it's not super common, but it has happened numerous times. So, like, but the real question is then, if the vice president really doesn't have that much power other than the cases where he takes over as president, then why are some vice presidents considered more powerful and some are less? Well, the answer is if the question is what determines really how much presidential power, or how much power a vice president has, the answer is how much power that president gives him, right? So some presidents have made their vice presidents important and powerful, and some haven't. Do you give the vice president important things to do? Do you include him in on the important meetings? If the answer to that is yes, then the vice president is pretty powerful. If the vice president is pushed aside and doesn't get to go to the big meetings and doesn't get to do a lot of important things, then he's not very powerful, right? So, Dick Cheney under George Bush was considered one of the most powerful vice presidents because George Bush relied on him for a lot of advice. I'd say Mike Pence is sort of in between. You've had weak vice presidents like Dan Quayle, who's George H.W. Bush's vice president, was probably not very important at all because Bush didn't really trust him and didn't use him for very much of things of importance. In fact, one thing Quayle was sent to do as vice president was to judge like a middle school spelling bee somewhere, just to represent the president. I guess, I don't know, more of a head of state type thing. And he went to that spelling bee and he even screwed that up because the kid who was asked to spell the word potato, and he spelled it Potato, which is how you spell potato. And Dan Quayle famously said, "Oh man, you're so close. You just forgot that one little letter at the end." And that one letter, and the kid finally writes like an E on the board. And he's like, "Yeah, there you go, potato." And of course that's not how you spell it. So that got national attention in the news, and it was very embarrassing. So you have people like Dan Quayle who were not very powerful as vice president, and then you have people like Dick Cheney who were very powerful as vice president. Again, I'd say Mike Pence is maybe somewhere in between those two. I think the president does trust him. President Trump does trust him, so he probably be considered a fairly powerful vice president. So what goes into the president's decision to choose a certain vice president? And so a lot of times, when the president, once you get the nomination for your party, you get to pretty much choose anyone you want to as your running mate, as long as they meet those qualifications that we talked about, maybe an hour ago or so. But yeah, a lot of times what we say is you pick someone who helps you balance the ticket. Now this could be geographically balancing the ticket or based on like, age, religion, charisma, experience, as you can see. Basically, you want to pick someone who adds something to the ticket. Well, the ticket is what we refer to. The ticket is the team of people because you run as a team. So the ticket would be the person running for president, and the person running for vice president is called the presidential ticket. Okay, so when you vote, you're voting for the Republican ticket or the Democratic ticket or the third party ticket, whatever. But so basically, you want to pick someone who helps you win, gives you a better chance to win by improving your stakes or raising your status. So you strengthen the ticket by balancing the ticket oftentimes. Now, not all people have done this. They haven't always picked someone, to balance the ticket. But the best example, one of the best examples was the one you see here, where John F. Kennedy was the nominee for the Democratic Party. Lyndon Johnson was also considered to be a top candidate for president, but Kennedy chose him as his running mate, and this provided two types of balance on the list there. One, Kennedy was a Northeasterner. They were both senators, but Kennedy was from the Northeast and a very elite background, wealthy family, powerful family. Johnson was from Texas in the South, so he helped balance the ticket geographically, right? Helping Kennedy reach out to more Southern voters who were skeptical of maybe this Northeastern senator. Also, Kennedy was the first Catholic to be elected president. That doesn't seem like it should matter, but to a lot of Americans back then, they were skeptical of voting for a Catholic. And so Johnson was a Protestant Christian. So this helped provide some balance in terms of religion also. Anyway, so that was one example. But a lot of times it's just like, does the vice president maybe have experience that you don't have? Donald Trump had no previous political experience, so he picked Mike Pence, who had been governor of Indiana and had also been a member of Congress for several years in the House. So he had experience in Washington, D.C. and running a state, which helped balance the ticket in that way. But the vice presidency often gets sort of ridiculed or made fun of. One columnist here said the vice presidency is sort of like the last cookie on the plate. Everybody insists you won't take it, but somebody always does. So, a lot of people, if you ask them, hey, would you take if the president nominated you, would you accept the nomination for vice president? Especially they ask people as they're running for president and maybe not doing very well. And they typically say, oh, no, I'm not really, I don't want to be, I'm not running to be vice president, I'm running to be president. But ultimately, you see these people change their mind. Somebody does. And this was a quote from a vice president. And just to give you an example, like, can you name a vice president from the past, not including the most recent ones who you may have heard of, like I just mentioned, like Dick Cheney, or, I hope Joe Biden and Mike Pence. But but like, would you be able to name any other vice president from the past? Well, here's one of them, Thomas Marshall. And the catch is, can you name one that never became president? So it'd be cheating if you said, well, John Adams, he was vice president, but he also was president eventually. Or like like Harry Truman, who took over for Franklin Roosevelt. But could you name, so you see one here, Thomas Marshall, could you name a vice president who never became president? And I bet a lot of you could not. Anyway, so this guy, Thomas Marshall, was vice president under Woodrow Wilson. He said, once there were two brothers, one ran away to sea, the other was elected vice president of the United States, and nothing was heard from either of them again. So another amendment that's relevant here to the presidency is the 25th Amendment. The 25th Amendment basically is the one that answers a lot of what-if questions. The original Constitution did say that if the president dies or leaves office for whatever reason, the vice president takes over. But one thing that wasn't clearly dealt with was what happens if the vice president leaves office. So originally that was like, I don't know what to do. I mean, we'll just leave it vacant or hope for the best. But so the 25th Amendment answers some of the questions that the original Constitution did not answer. For one, it says if the vice president leaves office, dies, resigns, gets impeached and removed, then the president picks a new vice president, whoever he wants, as long as they're, meet the basic qualifications under the Constitution. And then the House and Senate would have to approve of that person. So this happened with Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon's vice president resigned actually before he did, Spiro Agnew. And so Nixon picked Gerald Ford to be his new vice president. And the House and Senate approved of his choice of Gerald Ford, and he became vice president. Then Nixon resigned a few months later, so then, under the Constitution, Ford jumps up and becomes president. Then he was vice president, so he has to now pick a new vice president, Nelson Rockefeller, and then he had to be approved by the House and Senate. So that was a very interesting circumstance where the 25th Amendment kicked in. But another thing has to do with disability. So remember I said one of the powers of the vice president is to declare if the president's disabled. So if the 25th Amendment also covers the situation where the president is unable to perform his duties, right? He's unable to do his job, the vice president can take over at least temporarily and do that job. All right, so another big part of the executive branch is what we call the cabinet department. And we'll cover this more when we get to the bureaucracy. But the cabinet is basically just the generic name for some of the top advisors to the president. So it includes the heads of the major departments, the 15 major executive departments that are considered cabinet level departments. And that would be, I'm not going to name all of them, but like the Department of State, the Department of Treasury, the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, Department of Agriculture, Department of Labor, Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Education, Department of Energy, Department of Homeland Security, and on and on and on. So there's 15 of those. All of those departments, the heads of those departments are all called Secretary of, except one, which is Department of Justice, which is not Secretary of Justice, but the Attorney General heads the Department of Justice. But other than that, they're all like Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury. So, but the president can also elevate people to cabinet level. The vice president also serves on the cabinet, but like the administrator of the EPA is traditionally a cabinet official, the Environmental Protection Agency. The president's chief of staff is typically named to be part of the cabinet, or etc. So the cabinet sometimes meets and might help the president reach certain decisions or give him updates on what's going on in the government and stuff like that. Now, some cabinet departments are more important than others. A lot of this has to do with what does your cabinet department do. Now, so some textbooks will use this term inner cabinet. The inner cabinet traditionally refers to these four top cabinet secretaries and the attorney general. You have three secretaries. So you have the Secretary of State. State Department is in charge of foreign policy, like regulating U.S. diplomacy around the world, keeping peace with other countries, staffing our embassies overseas. So you have the State Department, you have the Department of Defense, which used to be called Department of War. So the Secretary of Defense is also part of the inner cabinet. The Secretary of the Treasury, right, which is in charge of our taxes and the debt and things like that, and currency. And then you have the Attorney General, who's the head of the Department of Justice, which is our law enforcement agency, main law enforcement department. So those four are sometimes called inner cabinet because they're probably closer to the president. They probably work with him on a more regular basis. They have more direct influence and contact because they head such important departments, right? So frankly, if you're in charge of our defense and our military as Secretary of Defense, that's more important than being in charge of the Department of Education or the Department of say Veterans Affairs or something. It just is. Okay, so that these people tend to be a little more powerful as cabinet officials. Of course, they also head up their agencies, so that gives them power. So can you name any of these people? Now, President Trump has undergone, a little bit more turnover in his cabinet than the typical president in his first term. So I've had to update these several times, but I think we're good updated as of now, April of 2020. So as of now, we have the Secretary of State. So you're supposed to write these down on your notes if you're filling out my handout. You have Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Right, so that means, again, he's in charge of the State Department, foreign policy. He's a very trusted advisor to the president right now. I think President Trump has a lot of faith in Mike Pompeo. He's been very loyal to the president, very supportive publicly. You have Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin. So it's pronounced Mnuchin. And yeah, he is a good-looking guy for sure. Sexy guy. But he's actually married to like a former supermodel. I'm sure it has nothing to do with the fact that he's a billionaire, but anyway. So he's in charge of the Secretary of Treasury, very important job, right? So they're in charge of things like managing the national debt and paying off our debts, currency, tax collection, so printing currency, but collecting taxes is an important department. You have the current Secretary of Defense is a gentleman named Mark Esper. So he heads up, of course, the president's ultimately in charge of the military, but the Secretary of Defense really oversees the main branches of our military, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. And then you have the Attorney General, William Barr. He's in charge of the Department of Justice. He's the only one not called Secretary of, but they're supposed to be like, again, the president technically is the chief law enforcement officer of the country, but really the Attorney General is the head of this department that enforces the laws, Department of Justice, prosecutes federal crimes. Now, I mentioned I'd say one of the more important cabinet departments, other than that's not technically part of the inner cabinet, but really it is, and that's the Homeland Security Department. This is the newest of our 15 departments, but it's also very important because the Homeland Security Department's in charge of, again, just because they're in charge of really important things. Things like border patrol, airport security. They're the ones who, they have FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, so they're doing a lot of the stuff right now to manage this coronavirus and send out medical equipment to the states, and they keep our emergency stockpiles, and also the Coast Guard is part of the Homeland Security Department. It's just a really important department. It was created after 9/11. Its main job was to sort of prevent future terrorist attacks. But really, it does other things that are very important to keeping our country safe. So I'd say, right now it's an acting secretary, meaning that the previous secretary was fired basically by President Trump. And so right now this guy is appointed, but could be officially submitted to the Senate, or he could submit someone else's name to become the official Secretary of Homeland Security, but Chad Wolf. All right, we're getting close to the end here. So the cabinet makes up one big part of the bureaucracy or the executive branch. The other big chunk of the executive branch is made up of these various offices that are part of what we call the EOP, the Executive Office of the President. And some of the agencies that are part of this, not all, but I'm just going to give you a few of the key ones. All right. So one is the Office of Management and Budget. Very important. The OMB is very important. They help plan the budget that the executive branch runs under. So they help the president put together the budget he'll submit to Congress each year. But they also sort of manage the executive branch, as you can see by the name. They kind of determine which agencies need what type of funding, and they kind of do a lot of accounting for the executive branch and budgeting and things like that. So it's a really important agency helping to run the complex nature of the executive branch, make sure things run more smoothly. The National Security Council is very important advisory group to the president. So unlike the cabinet officials who kind of run their departments, these EOP agencies are more in charge of directly advising the president and running the executive branch from the White House standpoint. And so you have the National Security Council. These would be it's headed by a national security advisor, but also includes like the vice president, the president's chief of staff usually, some of the top generals, what we call the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, top generals in the military of each branch. It would include other top officials like Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. Anyway, so the National Security Council is very important in advising the president on military and national security issues. You have the Council of Economic Advisors, which there's other economic advisors in the executive branch, but they help the president, as it sounds, as the name suggests, gives him advice on the economy and which direction he should go on different matters relating to the economy and what he should propose to Congress and things like that to keep the economy strong. And you also have the White House office, which you can't see, but it says it's his personal staff. So the White House office, unlike some of these other positions, unlike cabinet officials and stuff, the president can pick anyone he wants to be in the White House office. These are his own personal staff members. So it's very important. It's headed up by a person called the Chief of Staff, who I've mentioned a few times. The Chief of Staff is like traditionally the top advisor to the president. They basically run the White House. And it's not only a top advisor to the president, but someone he usually really trusts. And now again, President Trump has had a lot of turnover in this position. I think he's on his 4th chief of staff recently. He picked a new one, but he can hire and fire these people at will. But the chief of staff traditionally plays a very important role in coordinating White House staff and helping the president with all sorts of things, advice on different issues, but also his political strategies, his re-election strategies. It's just a hugely important position. So the chief of staff, you should know, is a very important position within the White House office. But also the White House office would include, say, the press secretary, which again, the press secretary usually is a very important person because they give daily updates to the media. Now, the president is currently on his, I think, 4th press secretary. So again, he hasn't really used that position. In fact, the press secretary, his previous press secretary, never had one single press briefing during her term in office. So that's never happened, since I can remember. So things are just sort of not very non-traditional, to say the least, during President Trump's presidency. So you had a press secretary who never gave a single press briefing to the White House press corps. But again, traditionally, in other presidencies, the press secretary would give a daily update to the White House press corps and answer their questions about what's going on with the executive branch, which is important so the American people can, through the media, they're supposed to be our watchdogs of the government. And so traditionally presidents have held daily press briefings. The press secretary holds daily press briefings. The president would sometimes then hold like a press conference where he answers questions, but instead Trump kind of acts as his own press secretary. You also have in the White House office would be a position called the White House White House Counsel, which is the president's top legal advisor. when the president was impeached, when President Trump was impeached during the trial, like a lot of people in the White House counsel's office helped represent him as his lawyers, but really it's supposed to be not his personal lawyer, but like someone who gives the president advice on his power as president. So like if the president wanted to order an executive order, issue an executive order, or make some decision that could be questionable constitutionally, the White House counsel's job is to tell him whether that would be legal or not. Okay, so anyway, but it also includes like the first lady has her own staff, the vice president has his own staff. So all these people are part of the White House office staff. Okay, so that pretty much wraps it up here. Make sure you paid close attention. Hopefully you wrote down some good notes. I'm keeping it so it looks like about an hour and a half, so you guys should be able to chunk it into 30-minute sections. So hopefully this helped you out and learn more about the executive branch. We have our final slide here. I used to have a song on here, but I took it off because I'll get in trouble for copyright violation. I don't know if you guys noticed my Scooby-Doo shirt I have on today, but if you guys were fans of Scooby-Doo. But anyway, so hope you guys enjoyed it, and stay safe, and talk to you guys later.